The Dungeon's Dark Legacy. Beneath the grandiose splendor of Edinburgh Castle lay a world far removed from the regal halls and noble chambers, a shadowy underbelly that held the memories of betrayal, agony, and death. The dungeons, carved into the volcanic rock of Castle Rock itself, were places where time seemed to stand still. The air was heavier here, thick with the unspoken sorrow of countless prisoners who had met their end in chains. Ellie and Callum descended the narrow stone staircase leading to the lower chambers, the walls damp and slick from centuries of condensation. Flickering lights from modern fixtures did little to dispel the oppressive darkness, which seemed to press closer the further they went. The silence, broken only by the occasional drip of water, felt absolute. "Some welcome," Callum muttered, his voice subdued as if afraid to disturb the dead. Ellie didn't respond. Her mind was consumed by the accounts she had read about this place. Gruesome details of lives broken and ended within these walls. A history of suffering. The dungeons of Edinburgh Castle were infamous long before the modern era, their notoriety rooted in centuries of war and political upheaval. The castle, strategically perched on Castle Rock, had seen countless sieges and conflicts, often resulting in captured enemies being dragged into its bowels. During the Wars of Independence, the English had used the dungeons to house Scottish captives, treating them with unspeakable cruelty. It was said that some prisoners were shackled to the walls and left to starve, their cries echoing through the stone corridors until they faded into silence. The lucky ones were executed quickly, their heads displayed on spikes as grim warnings to others. In the centuries that followed, the dungeons became a place of torment for anyone who fell afoul of those in power. Religious dissenters, political rebels, and even common thieves were confined here, their punishments tailored to fit the severity of their crimes. Iron collars, iron cages, and crude racks were among the tools of suffering used to extract confessions or to prolong agony. Perhaps the most infamous tales were those of the witch trials. Accused witches were dragged to the castle, their confessions often wrung from them through torture before they were condemned to death. Many were burned at the stake just beyond the castle gates, their ashes scattered to the wind while their screams haunted the living. Ellie paused by a rusted iron ring embedded in the wall. Chains had once been fastened to it, and she could almost see the shadow of a figure slumped against the cold stone, their wrists bloodied from trying to pull free. She reached out and let her fingers brush the ring, the metal surprisingly cold despite the humid air. "People died here," she said softly, more to herself than to Callum. Callum, standing a few paces behind her, crossed his arms. "People die everywhere, Ellie. That doesn't mean they're still hanging around to chat." But Ellie didn't respond. Her thoughts were drawn to one prisoner in particular, William Kirkwood, a young soldier accused of treason during the Jacobite Rebellion. The betrayer's ghost. William Kirkwood's story had become the stuff of legend. A loyal soldier under Bonnie Prince Charlie, Kirkwood had been captured by British forces after a failed assault on the castle. Accused of betraying his comrades to the enemy, he was dragged to the dungeons and subjected to weeks of torture. The records were sparse, but they told enough. Kirkwood refused to confess, even as his body was broken and his spirit crushed. Eventually, his captors grew impatient. They executed him in the courtyard. His body hung in chains for days as a warning to others. Yet, as the legend went, Kirkwood did not rest. Over the years, visitors to the castle had reported seeing a figure in tattered clothing wandering the dungeons. Some described hearing a man's anguished screams echoing through the corridors, while others spoke of being touched by unseen hands or feeling a crushing weight on their chests. Ellie had read these accounts with fascination, noting the consistency of the sightings. The ghost of William Kirkwood, she believed, was not merely a figment of collective imagination, but an imprint left behind by unimaginable suffering. "Ellie, you're zoning out again," Callum said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. She blinked and turned to him. "I was just thinking about Kirkwood, his story, what he endured down here." Callum sighed. "It's a tragedy, no doubt. But let's not forget that stories like his get embellished over time. A few details change, and suddenly you've got a full-blown haunting." Ellie didn't argue. Callum's skepticism was his armor, and she wasn't about to strip it from him. Instead, she moved deeper into the chamber, her flashlight cutting through the shadows. The watchful eyes. The deeper they ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, her eyes scanning the darkness for any movement. The sensations began subtly at first, a faint pressure on her chest, a whisper of air that didn't match the direction of the draft. But as they explored further, the feeling intensified. At one point, Callum stopped abruptly, rubbing his arms. "Did you feel that?" he asked, his voice low. Ellie turned to him. "Feel what?" "Hey, I don't know. Like someone brushed past me." He glanced around, his bravado slipping for just a moment. Ellie tilted her head. "Someone? Or something?" Callum forced a laugh, but it was hollow. "Let's not get carried away." But Ellie noticed how his hand hovered near his pocket, where he kept his phone. As much as he mocked the idea of ghosts, Callum wasn't immune to the castle's atmosphere. A glimpse into the past. They reached the lowest chamber, where the air was damp and carried the faint scent of decay. The walls here were lined with crude carvings, names, dates, and messages scratched into the stone by prisoners desperate to leave their mark. Ellie ran her hand over one carving, the grooves worn shallow by time. It read, "God save my soul, 1673. These were real people," she said softly. "Not just names in a book. They lived, they suffered, and they died," Callum added grimly. "Probably right here." Ellie nodded, her fingers lingering on the stone. She closed her eyes, trying to imagine what it must have been like. The cold, the darkness, the knowledge that escape was impossible. She could almost hear the faint echoes of voices, pleading and cursing, as if the walls themselves had absorbed their agony. And then, just as quickly, the sensation was gone. "Let's move on," Callum said, his voice tight. "This place is starting to get to me." Ellie glanced at him and saw the unease in his expression. For all his skepticism, even Callum couldn't deny the weight of the castle's history. As they made their way back toward the surface, Ellie couldn't help but feel that they weren't alone. The castle's violent past lingered here, not as a memory, but as a presence, a shadow that watched and waited. And in the darkness of the dungeons, it was impossible to tell whether that presence was friend or foe. The headless drummer. As Ellie and Callum ascended from the dungeons into the open air of the castle courtyard, the transition from suffocating darkness to sunlight was almost disorienting. Ellie breathed deeply, the crispness of the Edinburgh air sharp in her lungs. But the reprieve was brief. Her mind remained tethered to the castle's labyrinthine depths, where the weight of history clung like cobwebs. Callum, dusting off his coat as if the dungeon's atmosphere could be shaken loose, turned to Ellie with a smirk. "So, what's next on your ghost hunting itinerary? Or do we take a well-earned coffee break?" Ellie smiled faintly, but said nothing. Her thoughts had already moved ahead to the next subject in her research. The castle's most infamous specter, the Headless Drummer Boy. The drummer's warning. The legend of the Headless Drummer Boy was as unsettling as it was enduring. The story dated back to the mid-1600s, when Edinburgh Castle was bracing for an attack by an unknown enemy. According to historical accounts, the sound of drumming echoed through the castle walls one foggy night, cutting through the stillness like a call to arms. The rhythm was steady, deliberate, a signal of imminent danger. When soldiers investigated, they were met with an eerie sight. A young boy dressed in military garb, playing a snare drum. His movements were precise, his posture rigid, but there was one horrifying detail. His head was missing. The apparition disappeared before anyone could approach. But the drumming continued, growing louder and more insistent. The castle's defenders scrambled to prepare for an attack, and within hours, their enemy arrived, laying siege to the fortress. Though the defenders held their ground, the eerie warning of the headless boy lingered in their minds. In the centuries that followed, the drumming would return, always heralding significant events tied to the castle, sieges, rebellions, and even disasters beyond its walls. The boy, faceless and nameless, seemed to exist not as a spirit seeking justice, but as an omen of strife and bloodshed. Ellie had read about the sightings, both historical and contemporary, with fascination. What struck her most was the consistency of the descriptions. Soldiers, castle staff, and even tourists had reported hearing the drumming, often at night when the castle was shrouded in shadow. But it wasn't just the sound that unnerved them. It was the feeling that accompanied it. A heavy, oppressive sense of doom, as if the boy's appearance carried with it the weight of the tragedy to come. A drumbeat in the fog. Ellie and Callum stood at the edge of the castle's ramparts, overlooking the city below. The view was breathtaking, but Ellie's attention was elsewhere. She had asked Fergus MacLeod, the grizzled groundskeeper, about the drummer boy during their last conversation, and his response had been as cryptic as it was unsettling. "You don't want to hear those drums, lass," Fergus had said, his voice low and gravelly. "Not unless ye're ready for what comes after." Now, as Ellie gazed at the sprawling city, she couldn't shake his words. She clutched the strap of her satchel, feeling the weight of her notebooks and recording equipment inside. This trip wasn't just about uncovering history. It was about documenting the truth, no matter how dark. Callum, who had been scrolling through his phone, glanced up at her. "You're thinking about him, aren't you? The headless kid." Ellie nodded. "There's something about his story that feels unfinished. If he really does show up before tragedy, then why? Is he trying to help? Or is he part of the tragedy itself?" Callum shrugged. "Maybe he's just a residual haunting, like a loop on an old tape. No intention, no meaning. Just a fragment of history stuck on repeat." Ellie considered his words, but couldn't fully accept them. The boy's appearances felt too deliberate, too tied to the castle's darkest moments. There was a pattern, and she was determined to uncover it. The first encounter. That night, Ellie convinced Callum to stay late at the castle. While the daytime bustle of tourists and guides had long since quieted, the castle remained open for private bookings and special research visits. Fergus had reluctantly granted her access, muttering something about curiosity being a dangerous thing. Ellie and Callum positioned themselves in the Great Hall, a cavernous room filled with relics of Scotland's past. Suits of armor stood guard along the walls, their hollow eyes watching in silence. Above them, a vast timber ceiling loomed, its beams carved with intricate patterns. Ellie set up her audio recorder on a wooden table, her movements deliberate and practiced. She had done this many times before, though never in a place as storied or as haunted as this. "Remind me why we're sitting here in the dark, waiting for a ghost that might not even exist?" Callum asked, leaning back in his chair. "Because legends don't come from nowhere," Ellie replied. "And if the drummer boy is tied to the events at this castle, then his story is worth understanding." Callum sighed but didn't argue. Hours passed, and the castle remained eerily quiet. The occasional creak of wood or whisper of wind was all they heard. Callum had started to nod off when Ellie stiffened, her gaze snapping toward the far end of the hall. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Callum sat up, his expression wary. "Hear what?" Ellie held up a hand, signaling for silence. The faintest sound reached her ears, soft, rhythmic, and unmistakable. A drumbeat. It was distant at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing second. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls and filling the room. Callum's face went pale. "No way. That's got to be someone messing with us." Ellie shook her head, her heart racing. "There's no one else here." The drumbeat was steady and deliberate, as though guiding invisible soldiers into battle. Ellie felt a chill crawl up her spine as the temperature in the room plummeted. Suddenly, the drumming stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against her ears like a physical weight. Then came the footsteps. They were light and quick, like those of a child, echoing through the hall. Ellie and Callum both turned toward the sound, but there was no one there. "Ellie," Callum whispered, his voice trembling. "We need to go." But Ellie didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the far corner of the room, where a shadow seemed to shift and ripple, as if trying to take form. For a moment, she thought she saw him, the boy in his tattered military uniform, standing silently in the darkness. He didn't move, didn't breathe. but his presence was undeniable. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. The drumming resumed, this time fainter, as if retreating into the distance. Ellie's hands shook as she turned off the recorder, her mind racing. "Let's get out of here," Callum said again, his tone more urgent. Ellie nodded, her voice failing her as they hurried out of the hall. But even as they left the castle behind, the sound of the drumbeat lingered in her mind, an unrelenting echo of the boy who watched over Edinburgh Castle and its bloody history. The drumming in the night. Night descended over Edinburgh Castle, and with it came an almost oppressive stillness. The chatter of tourists and the shuffling footsteps of guides had long since faded, leaving the fortress in silence. The only sounds now were the occasional rustle of the wind brushing against stone walls and the faint hum of distant city life below the castle rock. Ellie stood near her small desk in the castle's temporary research office, gazing out of the window at the dimly lit grounds below. The room, provided for her by the Historical Preservation Society, was tucked into one of the castle's quieter wings. Though she had spent countless nights in old buildings and ruins, there was something unnerving about being inside this fortress after dark. "Are you actually planning on sleeping here tonight?" Callum asked from behind her. He was sprawled on a narrow sofa, his feet propped up on a pile of books. Ellie turned toward him, her expression a mix of determination and apprehension. "It's the best way to observe. If anything's going to happen, it'll happen when the place is empty." Callum shook his head. "Right, because ghosts follow a strict schedule. Just so we're clear, when I said I'd help with your research, I didn't mean camping out in haunted castles. You didn't have to stay," Ellie said, smiling faintly. "I'm not leaving you here alone." He sighed. "Besides, I might as well stick around. Who knows? Maybe I'll finally see something that convinces me all this ghost business isn't just a load of nonsense." Ellie didn't respond. Her attention drifted back to the window, where the darkened courtyard stretched out like a void. Something about the quiet seemed off, as though the castle itself was holding its breath. The first echoes. It was nearing midnight when the first sound came. Ellie had been reviewing her notes on the headless drummer boy, her pen scratching against the page, when she froze. Faint and distant, almost imperceptible, came the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of a drumbeat. She straightened in her chair, her pulse quickening. The sound was so soft it could have been a trick of her imagination, but as she strained to listen, it grew louder. "Callum," she whispered, her voice tight. Callum sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What is it?" "Listen." He frowned, tilting his head. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then it came again, a steady, deliberate rhythm, like someone striking a drum in the far-off shadows of the castle. "You've got to be kidding me," Callum muttered, his skepticism faltering. Ellie rose from her chair, moving toward the door. The sound seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper within the castle, its echoes bouncing off the stone walls. "Where are you going?" Callum asked, scrambling to his feet. "To find the source," Ellie said, her voice resolute. Callum groaned but followed her, muttering under his breath about curiosity and its deadly consequences. Into the darkness. The corridors of Edinburgh Castle at night were a labyrinth of shadows. The torches that lined the walls flickered weakly, casting distorted patterns across the stone. Ellie held a flashlight in one hand, its beam slicing through the gloom as she led the way. The drumbeat continued, growing louder with each step. It wasn't frantic or chaotic, but steady and deliberate, as though the unseen drummer were guiding them somewhere. "This has to be someone playing a prank," Callum said, his voice low, but tinged with unease. "Who?" Ellie countered. "The castle's locked down. Fergus said the night guards stay outside the gates. Maybe one of them snuck in." Ellie shook her head. The sound wasn't coming from a single direction. It seemed to surround them, filling the corridors with its eerie cadence. They descended a narrow staircase that led to the lower levels of the keep. The air grew colder as they moved, the chill seeping through their clothes and into their bones. Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into something, like moths to a flame. Finally, they reached a large wooden door that led to the old barracks. Ellie hesitated, her hand on the iron handle. The drumming was louder now, resonating through the wood, as though it were on the other side. "Ellie?" Callum said, his voice tense. "Are you sure about this?" "No," she admitted. Then she pushed the door open. A room of echoes. The barracks were dark and cavernous, their high ceilings lost in shadow. Rows of rotting cots lined the walls, and the faint smell of damp wood hung in the air. Ellie swept her flashlight across the room, but there was no sign of anyone or anything that could be making the sound. And yet the drumming persisted. It seemed to emanate from the very walls, vibrating through the stone as though the castle itself were alive. Ellie stepped forward cautiously, her flashlight beam steady. Callum lingered near the doorway, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "Do you see anything?" he asked. Ellie didn't answer. Her focus was drawn to the far end of the room, where a faint glow seemed to flicker in the darkness. She moved closer, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor. As she approached, the glow resolved into a faint, ethereal outline. A figure stood there, a boy, no older than 13, dressed in a tattered military uniform. His headless body clutched a drum, his hands moving with precision as he played the same steady rhythm. Ellie froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure didn't acknowledge her presence, his movements mechanical, almost ritualistic. "Callum," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What?" he said, his tone impatient. "Come here." Callum hesitated, then stepped forward reluctantly. When he saw the figure, he stopped in his tracks, his mouth opening in stunned silence. "Holy, is that?" "Yes," Ellie said, her voice barely audible. They stood there, watching the boy play, the sound of the drum filling the room like a heartbeat. Ellie felt a strange mix of fear and sorrow as she gazed at the ghostly figure. He seemed trapped in an endless loop, bound to the castle by forces she couldn't begin to understand. Suddenly, the drumming stopped. The boy's hands fell still, and for a moment, the room was deathly silent. Then he turned, even without a head. The boy seemed to look directly at them, his body radiating a cold, otherworldly energy. Ellie felt a wave of dread wash over her, as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice. The boy raised one hand, pointing toward the doorway behind them. Ellie turned, her flashlight illuminating the empty hall beyond. She didn't see anything unusual, but the message was clear. "We need to go," Callum said, his voice shaking. Ellie nodded, backing away slowly. The boy didn't follow, his figure fading into the shadows as they retreated. But the drumbeat resumed, softer now, as if bidding them farewell. A warning unheeded. Back in the safety of the research office, Ellie replayed the events in her mind. She couldn't deny what she had seen, and the implications were staggering. The headless drummer boy wasn't just a legend. He was real, and he had tried to tell them something. "What do you think he wanted?" Callum asked, his voice subdued. "I don't know," Ellie said, "but I don't think it's over." Callum didn't respond. The look in his eyes said everything. This wasn't a ghost hunt anymore. This was something far darker, and the castle wasn't finished with them yet.